So I have my next project here. This is the famous low-profile Harvest Right pump. Even has a little logo embossed in the case. But I want to do a baseline of this. This is a used pump. It has something that's been stuck here, paper towel or something. But I want to get a vacuum reading on here, but I can't. It won't take my vacuum gauge, so I'm gonna have to take the hose off my freeze dryer and put it on here so I can attach my vacuum gauge. So I find that interesting that the way this is all configured, it's very tight and low profile. So I got to go stop my freeze dryer, which is operating right now, and just put everything on hold so I can do that. So my beef stew is going to have to wait a few minutes, but on we go. So I had to reach into my bag of tricks to get my adapters to make this thing work. So don't get all panicky when you see all this stuff here. The other thing I noticed about this particular vacuum pump, there's not a switch on it. I looked everywhere. I cannot find a switch. So the only way I can turn this thing on is by plugging it in. And so I'm going to flip this thing all the way around to get the plug on the right side of the machine, which is right here. So we're going to go ahead and plug it in. And let me turn on my gauge. And we're going to see what this does. Unfortunately, Harvest Right did not tell me why this was returned. Now, this is an oilless pump. I have some pretty strong feelings about oilless pumps. And if you're thinking about getting an oilless pump, please don't. Pumps need to be lubricated, plain and simple. And while that's doing it, I'm going to bring up another app, and we're going to measure the sound of this thing, because I don't know how noisy this should be. So right now, we're about 60, well, I'm also talking. I'll shut up for a minute. 68 to 69 decibels. And then we're going to take a look at vibration. And vibration's not too bad. It's about 1.5. You can see it right. Well, it's going to be hard to see, but it's coming up at 1.5 on the vibration of this unit. So what I'm going to do is once we get a reading down here, I'm going to strip this sucker down, try to determine what's wrong with it, and I'm going to see if there's an easy way for those who own this low-profile oilless vacuum pump, a way to resurrect these things that's going to be cost-effective, because this is basically a disposable, non-serviceable pump. So we're going to see what we can do for all those who did invest some money and purchase these, because the biggest problem with these pumps now, in a classroom setting, in a laboratory, this is probably a good pump, but you have to remember when you're freeze drying, some of the moisture is not going to freeze on the chamber wall. Some of that moisture is going to get through and it's going to come into your pump, and that moisture on the pH scale is acidic. And because this doesn't have any oil inside to protect the bearings and the working parts inside, it's going to corrode those bearings and bushings and working parts, and the corrosion is going to lead to premature failure. So that is why I recommend, if you're going to freeze dry, you really have to have a vacuum pump that takes oil. You need that oil for protection. So I'm going to let this run for a while. We'll come back and take a look at this. Right now we're at 1480. Well, it's still dropping, 1461, and we'll see where it bottoms out. And this pump has been running for over 20 minutes, and it's around 1030 millitors. It's struggling to get past that. I mean, it's slowly going down, but it's really taking its time. It keeps on bouncing back and forth. So I'm going to go ahead and call this basically. So at 20 minutes, the best we did is 1030. That's not real good. If this was a premium pump, it would have blown its socks off a long time ago. So we're going to go ahead and open this up, take a look at it. The first thing, my initial reactions to this pump, and the thing I really did not really like is the amount of electronics underneath here. Electronics like this, I'm not sure why they're there. Just the more electronics you have, the more things can go wrong. And I'm actually going to crack this open and take a look at what kind of electronics. It may be like a VFD that's down in here, but if you take a look at the premium pump, it's pretty simple. The premium pump does have a small VFD. It's more of like a soft start to help the motor start, but this looks like it's pretty complicated, and we want to keep things simple and keep things inexpensive. So we're going to take a look at that and some other things. So why don't you join me on this journey, and we'll take a look to see what's going on with this. We're going to go ahead and start the teardown on this, and I don't want to think that this is a fruitless effort, but this pump, this low profile scroll pump, is a proprietary pump, which basically means that the manufacturer does not sell any of the parts to the public. They do not want to release any information to the public. They do not want the public doing anything with this pump. This pump has to be serviced by the manufacturer. So basically they're keeping all the cards to themselves, and they don't want people like me or you doing anything with this pump. And they have security tapes all throughout this pump. So if you open it up and you break the security tapes and you try to send it back for a warranty, they're just going to say sorry and send you on your way. So if it's within the 1-year warranty, don't do anything I'm about to do. So with that said, I mean, you see right here is the first security tape that we're going to break. And honestly speaking, I've already taken this pump apart once before. This is a really bad design. For one, all the electronics are down on the bottom, so that if you spill anything, of course, gravity is going to send any liquids down to the bottom, and that's where all the electronics are. And it's just not a good idea. Anyway, you're going to need a lot of Allen wrenches. So we're going to need a 2mm, a 2.5mm, a 3mm, and a 4mm. You're going to need a 10mm combo wrench. Eventually you're going to need some little mini wire ties, and you're going to need a pair of diagonal pliers and a Phillips screwdriver, you know, like one of these little things right here that you can reverse, go from Phillips to a standard. So anyway, there's going to be 6 bolts on the bottom that holds the top cover, and those have to come off first, and I believe those are going to be a 3mm. So I'm going to go ahead and take these out and then be right back with you. So we took these little screws off right here, and don't forget your egg carton to keep track of all the little screws and such. So we're going to take off this cover, and like I said, there's a security anti-tamper seal right there that we're going to go ahead and break. And this cover is kind of cheesy, to tell you the truth. And when you take a look at this, I really don't like the design. So they have a pusher fan here, and then they have a puller fan here. So basically, air comes into the front, blows across the pump, and exits on the back. But this is so tight that they're confining the air movement to a very small space. I really think it would just be better just to not even have a cover on this pump and to let the ambient air help cool down the pump. Well, speaking of the fans, the first thing we need to do, just to make things a little bit easier to access, we need to remove the fans. We're not going to take the electrical wires off the fans, but we're going to remove the two screws down here, the screws and nuts here, and the screws and nuts here. To get these out of the way, it's just going to make things a little bit easier to access. And they're just like a long screw nut and washer right there. And these fans, you can just swing them over to the side and out of the way for now. And we're going to do the same thing with the front. The two fans are out of the way. And we're just going to carefully bring this around to the front. On the front of the pump are going to be two rubber vibration mounts. And on top, there's going to be two stainless steel studs sticking through with a nut on top. Now, the interesting thing about these nuts is they're right up against the frame. So it's really difficult to take these nuts off because each peak of the nut is going to kind of rub up against the pump itself. But these nuts do not go all the way through. You have to take off the whole controller to get to the nut behind here, and that's just a lot of waste of time. So we're going to take our 10mm wrench, and because this is rubber, it's going to give a little bit, so we're just going to kind of take this off anyway, and each of the tips of the nut is just going to kind of rub up against the pump, and it's not a big deal. These will still come off just fine. And there's a nut, a washer, and a lock. So there's the washer, lock, washer, and nut right there. And we'll go ahead and do the other side just as well. Now, once again, very carefully, by supporting the fans and the whole pump itself, we're going to bring this back around so the back end of the fan is facing us. So we need to do the same thing to the rear mounts, but we have to remove some electrical wires and other things that are in our way. To the plug connection, there's some really teeny tiny Allen wrench screws, and those are going to be 2mm. So we got to take these off right here with a 2mm Allen wrench. On both sides. And I mean, they're not very tight. You can just use your finger as a backup on here. You really don't need a wrench in the back there. So they're just these two little things right there. And then this thing will come out of the way. So this will swing out of the way there. The diagonal cutters that I'm telling you about, there's a wire tie right here and a wire tie over there. We just need to cut just the wire tie itself to free up the wire harness here. And then there's a series of male and female plugs on the back, and they're all color coded. Blue goes to blue, green goes to green, and yellow goes to yellow. You can just go ahead and unplug all these, and that frees up the wire harness. And there's a whole bunch of other plugs back here that are not used. I don't know why. So I have a feeling that the chassis for this pump is used for all sorts of pumps. And so they make a standard chassis for many different pumps that are mounted on top of the chassis. So we have the two 10mm nuts on the back that we now have to take off. And with that said, this is about ready to lift off towards the front of this pump. There's a hose that goes down. This is the exhaust hose, goes down to this filter right here. You can just basically now lift up this pump from the rear mounts and from the front mounts and just pull this hose off like so. And now the pump is disconnected from the chassis. So we're just going to put the fans back onto the chassis here because we are not interested in the chassis. We're going to set that aside. And we're going to work on the pump. Now, in this case, we're not interested in working on the motor. We're just going to work on to the pump itself. And as you can see, here's another tamper-proof tape right here. And there was a tamper-proof tape right here. So they put these tamper-proof tapes all throughout this pump to keep people from playing around with it. Because if you do play around with it while it's in warranty, you will void the warranty. And like I said, the best thing you can do with what we're doing as far as maintenance is concerned, is just to clean the pump out. All right, with that said, we're going to remove the pump from the motor, and there is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 screws, and they are going to be not 4mm. I guess those are going to be 3. Those are going to be 3mm as well. So we're going to do this in a crisscross pattern, so we can remove this with equal pressure, and I'm going to do that off camera. All the screws holding the pump onto the motor are out. Before I pull this off, I just want to make a couple of reference points. So this is the exhaust port, so I'm just going to make a little arrow right here, and I'm just going to put down EX. That's the exhaust point. It's kind of hard to write anything on this pump because it's black, and I only have a black marker. Okay, so we're ready to lift this off. We're going to have to use a mallet to kind of bump the front of this off just a little bit. There's 3 little tabs you can gently bump. Just going to go around and around motion, and we're going to go ahead and lift this off like so. So you can kind of see the scroll. This is a typical pattern of a scroll pump. This is a base. This piece does not move, where this piece does. And it moves very little. It just barely moves, maybe a half an inch, if you can kind of see how that kind of wiggles around. And that does it very fast, and it just kind of pushes the air from one port to the other port, and it does it fast enough, and the tolerances should be close enough that it actually makes a vacuum. But I still think that rotary vane pumps are much better. Okay, now down in here is the gasket. We do not want to damage the gasket, so we're going to be very careful to lift this out of place. Do not pull, do not tug on it. Take it out nice and gentle, because if you stretch it, you're going to be kind of messed up here. So we're going to be careful of that piece right there. Now we can lift the scroll out. Now let me show you something here. So here's a wire connection here, and if you take a look at this kind of thing, it looks like an upside down comma. So this comma is like pointing down to the harvest right label. So when we put this back, this has to be pointing down to like the wire harness, and then this right here. So this is pointing to the top of the pump, and the beginning of the scroll is on the bottom of the pump where the mounts are. So just so you know what orientation we're using. Okay, so we're just going to go ahead and lift this up. And this can be complicated to put this back into place, because you have a whole bunch of little pins and things that have to be aligned, but it is possible to do. So this is a scroll. Now, it looks like this is made out of carbon or some kind of material. In the other Harvest Right scroll pump they have, there's an actual gasket that goes along the top of the scroll. This has no gasket. So this piece just has to rub on top of the piece in here. And I find that very interesting that there's not a gasket or any type of a sill on the top of the scroll to sill between the two halves. And that could be one of the reasons why the performance on this particular pump is so poor, is because for that reason. Unless this is machined extremely flat into very tight tolerances, I just don't see how this can sill so well against the other piece without wearing out. So anyway, this is the motor. Of course, you can see how it rotates right there. When I got this low profile scroll pump from Harvest Right. They didn't tell me what was wrong with it, although when I did the pre-test, I think it only went down to about 1400 millitorr. So hopefully when we put this back together again, we're going to clean it up. Maybe we can get something a little bit better. So I really don't know why this was returned back to Harvest Right. The motor does work, the fans work, hopefully the electronics work. But like I said, we're not interested in doing anything with the motor. So the motor is being set aside.